So this has my current title, but for 23 years, I was the co-founder and executive director of the High Line. And so for those of you, how many people have been to the High Line? Oh, a lot, good. It's gonna still be there whenever you come to New York, but it's a mile and a half on the west side of Manhattan. And I think the history is very important because, again, what we were talking about earlier, sometimes the only places now for new green spaces is old industrial spaces. So the High Line was a railroad. It was built in 1930, and then it was abandoned. And this is what I saw when I went up there, is it was like this magic green space that ran right through the city. And it changed in all different times of seasons. I heard it was going to be demolished. I went to a community board meeting and I met another guy. We didn't know each other. I said, you do it. He said, you do it. And we said, well, maybe we'll do it together. But we had no plan, we had no money, and we had no experience. My background was in marketing, and Josh was a travel writer. So not planners, not architects. And in some ways, that was the secret to the success, because we had to go out and get help from all of those different kinds of experts. One of the first things I did, we're talking about gardens, but I always like to also talk about a little bit marketing. The very first thing we did was get a logo to help people think about, because you couldn't go up there, so we wanted to give it a feeling before you went up there. It was also, we were a private group. And it still is run as a nonprofit or a PPP. But we had to partner with the government. There's our mayor at the time, Mayor Bloomberg, and it really was a partnership between public and private. When we started it, most people had no idea what the High Line was. And it took us years before we made any progress. And so we had an idea of doing a design competition where we asked people, you don't need to do realistic ideas. And we got 720 entries from all over the world. This was one of my favorites, a mile-long lap pool. Mr. Ma, this is bringing blue into the city in a big way. And they didn't have to be realistic. This was one from Russia that was more about artistic. I also love this idea, someone should still take this, an urban roller coaster. And this is also thinking about programming. It's not just about building public spaces. What are you going to do in those public spaces? And these are more just sort of the fun ideas. And then we had an exhibition in Grand Central. And the idea was the High Line is in one neighborhood, but we wanted to say this is a citywide project. And often people look to New York for inspiration. Y'all had one of our most inspiring projects right here. This is one of my favorite, and I'd always heard about it, I'd read about it, but it wasn't until last year that I got to actually visit it in person. And I was so impressed. It's one of those projects that's better in person than in photos. And such a great way of actually taking this sort of old infrastructure and reusing it. And again, Mr. Ma, this is that green and blue. And there's something about hearing water in cities is magical. So when we wanted to think about what were we going to do, we started asking people, what do you, we weren't also, it's sort of an advantage not being a designer or an architect, and this is something Mr. Ma and I share in common. We love design, but we want to hear what other people want. And so we did hundreds of community input sessions to hear what people wanted. And then we did a real competition. We had 4 winners for the competition. Zaha Hadid, not a lot of trees on her project. Michael van Valkenburg, I think one of the best landscape architects in the world. And then Stephen Hall, an architect that really, it was about building on green space. And this is what I always caution people of getting architects involved, because they want to build on top rather than just having the green space. We ended up going with a team led by James Corner, field operations, and then the architecture, Dillard Cafidio and Renfro, and Pete Uldoff. This was their competition entry. And it was, and what people finally said they want something inspired by the wildness up there, but something also new. And so it was really about this, and this again was this entry that they submitted. This is the entry. And it was about a planking system. And the reason I'm going to go into a little detail on this, the High Line was a very expensive project. It cost $300 million to build, but it was really about rehabbing the structure. The actual design is very inexpensive. Plants are inexpensive. And then this plant, this is what it was like when we went up there, but we couldn't leave it like that. We had to remove everything that was there and stabilize the structure. So basically, this is what it was like, not very romantic. This to get it to this state is really where we spent all that money. And so this planking system is really like parking curbs. It's like a kit of Legos that you put together. And here you can see it where we put the train tracks back. You can see, again, these are just concrete planks. But it's used in a different way where the green is like clawing back. The green is taking over the man-made. And here's what it looked like when we opened. The other thing that people often don't think about in public spaces is lighting. And normally when you go into a park in a city, you have overhead light, and it's in your eyes. It just lights the pathway. We wanted the light to light the pathway, but not be in your eyes and lighting the planting. So we put LED lightings on this railing. And the planting, I think, looks the most romantic. My favorite time is actually at night. And it's not in your eyes, so it's actually safer because your eyes can adjust to what it looks like. One of our architects said his job on the High Line was to save the High Line from architecture. So instead of building, it's about removing. And here's a place where we remove some of the steel to create an amphitheater over the city. The other thing that's very different about the High Line in Central Park, sort of New York's most famous green space, it was about an escape from the city. How could you feel like you're in the country when you're in the city? This is not an escape from the city. This is about the city. This is like the view is of traffic, and you can hear and smell the city. And I think you need both kinds of public spaces, but it's just sort of interesting. I asked Pete Uldorf if I could call our landscape a natural landscape, and he said it's actually idealized nature. Now, this is what was up there, but we knew we couldn't keep that. So what were we going to do? How are we going to, and there was this idea of keeping it wild, but it actually couldn't be real wild planting. And I think one of the things that's what Pete has done is thinking about these, instead of doing annuals, it's about perennials. This is Pete and his wife in their garden in Humalo. And this is how he designs, it's almost like art. And it's hard to see in there, but normally when you have a garden, you have here for tulips, here for grass, and here for shrubs. What he does is layers on top of it so it looks different at every different season. Whoops. The other thing that's hard about the High Line is in most places, there's only 13 inches of soil, so about this much soil. So you have to think about what's going to grow in that little amount of soil. There you can sort of see what you're actually dealing with. And it gets cold from the bottom and top, and then it gets hot. So it's like planting on a bridge. And this is when I asked him what his favorite time of year is, he always said fall, because he plans for the planting what they look like as they're dying or have died. Also very famous for using grasses. And this is sort of showing that seasonal. This is the exact same place in different times of the season. And one of my favorite is that he actually picks plants for what they look like when they're dead. So it's not just about when the flower is blooming, but what does it look like as it's dying or as it's actually dead? And again, this is where those grasses have these beautiful texture. And again, here are some of the plants that to me look just as beautiful in the middle of winter as they do in the summer. And of course, there are beautiful flowers. And by the layering, you have different blooms that start as early as February and go all the way to December. And the idealized part of nature is that it's actually, nature would actually have not as many species in one space. And so one of the tricky things is You have to actually remove plants. We spend more time removing plants than adding new plants. Here are just some other photos. And then this is a recent New York Times article. The High Line, we started it 25 years ago, and it's been open for 15 years. And it's really this idea of nature just sort of taking back the city. And I also like this idea of almost climate chaos. So how are these places that we can do to help integrate the changes that we're going to have, all of the water that comes, because we also have really bad flooding in addition to the heat, is put back into the planting. Now, the High Line is continuing to evolve. This is the last section that we just built. And this is the High Line ended, you can sort of see it in the corner, and there was a new park built about 2 blocks away, but it was this really dangerous highway intersection. So it was this idea of adding to it, and the mayor talked about new kinds of timber. So this is what we call glulam timber, and it was a way to be more environmentally friendly by capturing carbon. And again, this way, because it was new, we were able to put in more soil to have larger trees. That's one of the things that was very hard to do on the High Line, is to have trees because of how little soil. And I think the wood next to the nature, next to the city, is such a powerful juxtaposition. Now, one of the things you don't talk about that much is too much success. The High Line, we promised the city that it would be an economic generator, and it turned out to do that almost too much. This is a map of the over 100 different buildings that were built in the first few years of the High Line. This is Hudson Yards. This is 18 million square feet of development that's happening right at the end of the High Line. That's a Zaha Hadid building. She didn't design the High Line, but she designed one of her last buildings on the High Line. And this is the public space that was built at the end of the High Line. And the good news of that success is that the High Line will generate about $1.5 billion to the city over a 20-year time point. The city put in about $150 million. We raised the rest privately. We get about 8 million visitors. So that's about 1 million more visitors than the Metropolitan Museum. The Louvre, which is the most visited cultural, gets about 9 million. So putting it in perspective, but the Louvre is about 30 times our size. And ours are free. And so it actually makes it very difficult to maintain when you have that many people in a very small space. And then the other kind of things we never could have expected. Someone created a High Line perfume. You know, when we were starting, we were thinking, why would anyone want a fragrance about an abandoned railroad? You know, we found it was in comic books. I found this card, and it was so interesting that this was 4 years after we opened, that the High Line had become this new landmark in the city. And I think that's the other thing that's interesting is, I think coming forward, the landmarks are often not going to be buildings, they're going to be green spaces. And that's an opportunity. It's also less expensive than buildings. And so when a city wants to be competitive, you know, when you think about, I was so happy when the mayor said that New York was known for green spaces. 20 years ago, we hadn't built a new green space in decades. And then also it's about what do you do on the High Line. This is an example of, we have done about 450 free programs. So everything we do on the High Line is free. We do things for kids. We do things for adults. This was my favorite project. It was called a mile-long opera. I think it would be great to do here in Seoul. So normally when you go to an opera, you sit and people move and sing in front of you. This was 1,000 singers spread out the entire length of the High Line, and you walked by them. And so you listened to the opera as you walked that mile on the High Line. We also involved teens in the neighborhood. to work on the High Line and actually put on their own programs. You know, instead of us doing programs for teens, we asked young people what's the program they want to do on the High Line. The other thing that was really important to us was art. Chelsea is home to more galleries than anywhere in the world, but it's not that accessible to people. And now we have multiple museums like the Whitney, but the museum costs $25 to come in. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable going to art galleries. So we decided to bring the art into the park and the city. So this is an artwork that we put on a billboard. We put sculptures in the park, and they're all temporary. This is an artwork we did on the side of a building, and they're all only up there for 1 year. Here's some examples of other ones. And I think one of the things that I think when I think back why the High Line is successful and why when you are going to build public spaces in the future, they have to do so much more than just be green spaces. They have to be, and people want more out of it. In the old days, you would go to a theater, maybe for entertainment, or a playground for play. Now, people want all of that in one. They want nature, art, entertainment, play, wellness, and community in all one spaces. And I think that's what the High Line has done. It's also inspired projects all over the country. So we started something called the High Line Network. And it's actually not to learn how to do things like the High Line, but actually how do you learn from our mistakes and how do you learn from each other? This is a project that I think is fascinating. This was a park in Dallas. Dallas has a lot of cars. People don't walk at all in Dallas, in Texas. I'm from Texas. They built a park over the highway. You can sort of see how the highway cuts through this neighborhood, split this neighborhood in half. And people said, oh, people are never going to go to this park over a highway. It's been one of the most popular public spaces in Dallas. This is one in an old a floodway where they built a park in Austin. This is a really interesting park in Miami. So they had this tramway that went for 7 miles in Miami. And no one walks in Miami, and not just because it's hot. Everyone goes on cars. So they built this pedestrian connection underneath here. It's not, you know, they said, we're going to do this as inexpensively as possible and as quickly as possible. And it's really gotten people on their bike and walking and thinking about connecting different neighborhoods. Here's one of the biggest projects in Atlanta. There were old train tracks that went all the way around the city of Atlanta. It wasn't for passengers, it was for freight. It was called the Belt Line. And so they're slowly turning that into a park system that goes all the way around the city. The biggest project, if it ever gets built, is the LA River. It runs through multiple cities, and they still need it because the LA still floods. So how can you build a park? And this is, again, where I think Seoul offers great examples for us. Another one of my favorite parks, a new bridge in Washington, D.C., and this is designed by OMA, Rim Koolhaas. But what's interesting about this project is they thought about the community that it serves. This is one of the last Black, poorest neighborhoods in Washington. And so before they even built the project, they raised $60 million for a land trust to try to preserve the housing in the neighborhood. This is another project that I've been involved with. I'm the vice chair of this project. It was funded, this is right next to the High Line, a block away. And it was an old pier. This is where the Titanic was supposed to dock. That's why they left that part of the structure. They used to have parties and events, but it was falling, it was crumbling into the water. And so a gentleman named Barry Diller in New York, and his wife Diane von Furstenberg, you might have heard the DVF dresses, had this idea of doing a different kind of pier. And it was sort of built on these sort of pots that would hold greenery. And so they had to remove the pier because it was crumbling, and then they built this island in the middle of the Hudson River. These are the two access points. They built an amphitheater where you can have 700 people sit and watch the sunset and watch plays. So this is what it looked like when it opened. And again, this is that power of green. And just in a very few years, it has grown up and become this amazing green space where there was nothing, where there was just concrete. Again, this I like. And you can see the other thing it did is it made topographical change. When normally when you're at the waterfront, you're at a very low level. Here you go up 7 stories, so it gives great views of the city. It also gives you a different view and perspective on the water. So yeah, that's the opening in just 3 years. And again, this sort of combination of the man-made concrete and steel and planting to me is so powerful. And then one of the big challenges, though, is maintenance. How do you maintain these spaces? That's one of the, often I think it's easier to build or get money to build spaces because that's exciting. What's really hard is how do you pay to maintain them? So in this case, Barry Diller has endowed it for the city, so he'll continue to pay. And this is that event space. And there you can sort of look back and see the city. And then I wanted to talk about sort of these new forms. There's a great book called Palaces for the People where the author talks about social infrastructure. So, oh, I didn't take this off. And normally when you think of infrastructure for cities, you think of roads or hospitals. But I think we need to think of this soft infrastructure of green spaces. And normally, when I was talking about what makes the High Line successful, you have these siloed experience. In the old days, you went to a park for nature, you went to a museum for art, you went to a theater for entertainment, you maybe went to a church for community, you went to a gym for wellness. And now I think there's this need to have all of those things happening. And you don't always get them at once, but you're seeing that, here in Korea and Singapore. There's a great Queen Elizabeth Park that was built for the Olympics that brings all those things together. And I love going back in history for examples. And this is now I'm going to talk a little bit about what I'm working on now. And 2,000 years ago, the Romans had the Roman baths. And there were these amazing, and it wasn't just about getting clean. It is where they had the most important art. They had food. They had exercise. When I asked an expert on Roman baths, what was the main thing that happened there? And he said the most important thing was gossip. And gossip in a good way. This is where people connected from the poorest citizen to the wealthiest citizen. And I'd been at the High Line for 23 years. And then when I saw this project, this is a project that's in Germany and Romania, they basically came up with an idea, it's called Therma, to build a modern day Roman baths. And what it does is it combines nature, art, entertainment, play, wellness, and community all into one very big structure. These are really big. They've been doing it for about 20 years. There's 4 in Germany, 1 in Romania. And just to give you sort of the scale, the largest is about 70 square kilometers, 70,000 square kilometers. For Wembley Stadium is sort of a similar size. And the other thing that's very important is it's very accessible. It's not free, but it's less expensive than most of the other things people are spending, their leisure dollars on. And they've really become 2 of the most successful water parks in Europe. The other thing that's very important, people are going with their families. It's a really place for people to connect. And I think when we think about wellness and the environment, that's something that they can do together, is also reconnect us, not just to ourselves, but to other people around us. It's busy all through the year. And then I think this is the other important thing for this topic is the environment. So there's about 2,000 palm trees inside, but it's powered and supplied with water through geothermal wells. And then 90% of that water is recycled, and 80% of the heating is generated by those geothermal wells. And we're looking to expand all over the world. And so it's also, this is another way when we think about bringing the green and the blue together in projects like this. And, you know, I think I'm ending early. I thought I had so many slides, I thought I wasn't going to get through them all, but I got through them. Yeah, and I guess I just also want to congratulate y'all for, again, being a pioneer. I don't think y'all get enough credit for this. To me, was one of the very first infrastructure reuse projects that's happened. So thank you.